In just 5 minutes inside a federal courtroom in Washington, D.C., Judge Edward Thornton mocked Jasmine Crockett, calling her too young and accusing her of turning the court into a press room. But what he didn't realize was that the woman he tried to humiliate had come prepared, with a contract bearing his signature, a wiretap with his voice, and a plan that would bring the entire courtroom to its knees. When she pressed play on that recording, the room froze, the jury gasped, and the gavel was no longer in his hand. So what exactly did Jasmine reveal that forced a sitting judge into handcuffs? Stay with us. This is a story worth every second of your time. The courthouse in D.C. woke up like it did every morning, bailiffs chatting by the metal detectors, reporters sipping burnt coffee, jurors shuffling and half awake. But today, something felt wrong. People moved a little faster, spoke a little softer, glancing at each other with unspoken questions. No alarms blared, no sirens screamed, but the courthouse itself was holding its breath. Something was about to rupture, and behind those thick oak doors, it waited. Judge Edward Thornton sat perched above the courtroom, like a vulture carved in granite. His black robe flowed like a shadow, and his eyes, cold and unreadable, scanned the room as if it belonged to him. Because it did. For 30 years he'd reigned from that bench, dismantling careers with a sentence and silencing attorneys with a glare. Lawyers feared him. Defendants hated him, but no one challenged him. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. His power came from the precision of a scalpel, not the swing of a hammer. And when he ruled, his word didn't feel like opinion. It felt like fate. They said he'd never lost control of a courtroom. Not once. Not until today. The door creaked. Not loud, but loud enough. Jasmine Crockett stepped in. 27, poised, razor sharp in a navy suit, her stride steady like a soldier's. She didn't look left, didn't look right. Straight to the plaintiff's table. Her hands held no weapons, just a thick folder, heavier than it looked. Inside, enough proof to split the earth under Mitchell's feet. She didn't blink, didn't smile. She wasn't here for respect. She was here for war. And every eye in that room, from juror to janitor, followed her like she had already changed the verdict. An hour earlier, Pam Bondi's voice had crackled through her phone. Sharp, measured, deadly serious. Thornton doesn't make mistakes. If he's still on the bench, it's because someone powerful wants him there. You're not walking into a courtroom, Jasmine. You're walking into a minefield. Be careful. Jasmine didn't respond. She just ended the call, closed her eyes for half a second, and said the words she'd been carrying all week. Let him underestimate me. That's how this ends. Jasmine hadn't even finished setting her documents on the table when the strike came. And it didn't come from the opposing counsel. It came from the bench. Judge Edward Thornton, cloaked in his black robe like a Roman emperor, surveying a challenger in the arena, leaned forward ever so slightly, just enough to draw the full attention of the room. His eyes were sharp, predatory, not merely judging the case, but judging her. Miss Crockett, he began, letting the syllables crawl through his teeth like they were something foul. Before we proceed, I must ask, did the White House run out of trial lawyers with actual experience? Or is this part of some elaborate performance piece for the media? The courtroom froze. His voice, rich with sarcasm and perfectly measured disdain, cut across the room with surgical cruelty. It wasn't a question. It was a challenge. One designed to do exactly what it did, draw blood. The silence cracked a beat later with a low, smug chuckle from Robert Mitchell's attorney. A man with a Harvard ring, manicured hands, and a reputation for eating witnesses alive. He leaned back lazily in his chair, legs crossed, glancing at Jasmine like she was an intern who had wandered in with someone else's case file. Mitchell himself gave a slow, self-satisfied grin, the kind that came from knowing the system had always been tilted in his favor. A ripple of amusement spread through the gallery, small, cruel sounds that said everything without a word. She's in over her head. Even a few jurors shifted in their seats, not sneering, but skeptical, as if trying to reconcile the woman standing at the plaintiff's table with the courtroom heavyweight battle they were expecting. Jasmine was being erased before she even spoke, but Judge Thornton wasn't done. He adjusted the angle of his gavel slightly, a deliberate move, then continued, "This courtroom is not a podium, Miss Crockett. It is not a press conference, and it is certainly not a stage for interns fresh out of political grooming school." He cast a pointed look at the evidence binder next to her, then let his gaze sweep over the jury like a performer feeding his audience. "The matters before this court are serious. Millions of dollars in public funds, criminal allegations, reputations that hang in the balance. If you think this is the place for rehearsed speeches and clever sound bites, you're in the wrong room." He smiled slightly, the kind of smile that says, "I've already won." Another wave of quiet laughter crept through the rows behind her, like termites chewing through old wood. And in that moment, Jasmine Crockett wasn't just a young attorney. She was the lone figure in a room of sharpened knives. And yet, she didn't break, didn't blink, didn't even raise an eyebrow. The attack, though personal, was expected. Jasmine had long known that rooms like this didn't welcome women like her. Not this young, not this poised, not this dangerous. Her fingers, calm and deliberate, adjusted the position of the microphone in front of her. She didn't look to the jury for sympathy. She didn't glance around the courtroom for backup. She locked her gaze straight onto Thornton's, cold, steady, unblinking. She wasn't intimidated. She was calculating, measuring every move, not just his, but hers. She opened her folder slowly, methodically, her fingertips brushing across the first exhibit like a gunslinger choosing her bullet. The leather of her binder creaked faintly, the only sound in a room full of tension and stretched too tight. And when she spoke, she didn't raise her voice. She didn't match his volume. Instead, she cut the room with stillness. "With all due respect, Your Honor," Jasmine said, her voice steady as steel drawn from its sheath, "this courtroom may not be a press conference, but it's still a place where facts are meant to matter." Her hand slid the first document across the table like a declaration of war. "And while you may have doubts about who I am, what I bring today won't be judged by age, gender, or title. It will be judged by the evidence I'm about to present. And on that ground, I promise you, I'm more than prepared." The room didn't laugh now. It didn't breathe. For the first time, Jasmine had shifted the gravity ever so slightly in her direction. Not by shouting, not by posturing, but by standing so still, she forced the storm to come to her. And somewhere behind the gavel, behind the decades of power, Judge Thornton realized she hadn't come to ask for respect. She'd come to take it. Jasmine didn't break eye contact. Not for a second. Not when the judge offered his rehearsed denial. Not when the gallery shifted uncomfortably. And certainly not when Mitchell's attorney began to chew nervously on the cap of his pen. Her hands moved with unshaking purpose as she pulled yet another document from her folder. A photocopy this time, enlarged and highlighted in bold red. She placed it gently on the evidence display, slid it under the courtroom projector, and tapped her finger firmly on the bottom of the screen. The signature lit up above the jury like a spotlight had been cast on a crime. The air inside the courtroom grew impossibly still, as if even oxygen had stopped to listen. "Here's what you're looking at," she said, her voice level, almost surgical. "This document, dated March 18th, authorized a payment of $3 million in federal infrastructure funds to a shell entity, Everon Solutions, LLC, a company with no physical address, no federal contractor ID, no record of employees, tax returns, or completed projects." She let that sink in before flipping to the next slide, a screenshot from the Federal Business Registry. The entry for Everon was blank, except for the formation date and a legal agent name that led to a dead mailbox in Maryland. "Now," she continued, pulling up a third image, an enlarged high-resolution scan of a signature. "This signature, this isn't just anyone's. This is a federal clearance-level signature, a name tied to judicial oversight on more than 24 civil cases." She looked at the judge again, and this time, her voice sharpened by a half step. "And it matches, line for line, the one currently under your name on file with the Department of Justice." She paused. "Would you care to confirm whether or not this is your signature, Your Honor?" Judge Thornton's face was frozen in a mask of studied neutrality, but every inch of his posture betrayed the tension now crawling through his limbs. His fingers clenched slightly on the armrests. A faint muscle twitched in his cheek. He opened his mouth as if to speak, then closed it again. And when the words did finally come, they were wrapped in a condescending smirk that cracked at the edges. "Miss Crockett," he said slowly, "while I admire your flair for the dramatic, I cannot and will not confirm the authenticity of a single signature out of context. As I said earlier, I sign dozens, hundreds of documents daily, many of them administrative, many of them routine. If this particular document was routed through proper procedural channels, then it may well bear my name, but that is hardly proof of misconduct." The attempt to sound calm failed. His words spilled out just a little too fast. The room caught it. Everyone did. Jasmine took a step closer to the bench, not aggressively, but with the confidence of someone who no longer feared the height of the man above her. "So you're suggesting you may have signed off on a $3 million transaction with no memory of it?" she asked, voice low, deliberate. "A transfer that went to a contractor who doesn't exist, for a project that never happened, using taxpayer funds you were entrusted to safeguard?" She let the silence expand after that. Every heartbeat in the room seemed to echo against the walls. "Your Honor," she added, eyes narrowing slightly, "this isn't theater. This is accountability. And if you can't recall signing a document that directly implicates your bench in a federal corruption scheme, then I would say that's all the more reason to let an independent body verify the origin of this contract." There was a sound now, a hush of movement, jurors leaning in, reporters shuffling in their seats, scribbling furiously. The court clerk, eyes wide, glanced nervously at the judge before returning his gaze to the projected signature on the screen. Even Mitchell seemed to sink lower into his seat, sweat now visible at his temples. His attorney whispered something sharp and frantic into his ear. The tide had shifted, and the weight of it was starting to crush the men who had once ruled this courtroom like gods. But Jasmine Crockett stood untouched by the pressure. She wasn't pleading. She wasn't raising her voice. She was dismantling them with facts, and it was terrifying to watch. Still, Thornton tried to regain his ground. He sat up straighter, voice tightening into a judge's usual cadence, trying to remind the room of who he was. "Unless you can present sworn expert testimony or direct verification from the Department of Justice," he said, tapping the gavel lightly but without force, "I will not allow speculative claims to hijack these proceedings. I caution you, Miss Crockett, not to imply impropriety without fully vetted and legally admissible evidence." His words sounded official, authoritative, but his face betrayed him. His eyes no longer held certainty. They held calculation. He was stalling, buying time, trying to bury truth under protocol. And Jasmine saw it. She didn't hesitate. She turned, picked up the final document in the stack, and held it high. Another DOJ-authenticated signature analysis, complete with stroke comparison and a federal certification seal. "I came prepared," she said, her voice a little louder now, not for volume, but impact. "This is a forensic report from the Department of Justice's Signature Verification Unit, confirming with 99.7% certainty that the signature on the Everon contract is yours." She took a slow step forward. "That is not speculation. That is science. And the signature in question didn't just authorize a payment. It opened the door for the laundering of public money through a non-existent corporation. One that connects back to Robert Mitchell. One that links to this very courtroom." The room imploded in murmurs, audible gasps. One juror let out a breath, like she'd been holding it for 10 minutes. A young reporter in the back dropped his tablet, the plastic clattering like a gunshot. The clerk stared down at the DOJ report, his eyes widening with each line. But Jasmine? She didn't flinch. She had just lit the fuse, and she was waiting for the explosion. Jasmine didn't just point to the signature. She made the room feel it. With the contract projected in vivid clarity behind her, she held up the physical copy like it was a verdict carved in granite. "We can all see it now," she said, her voice calm but fierce. "And there's no mystery left to debate." Her tone didn't rise in volume. It deepened in force. "The signature at the bottom of this document is not approximate. It's not similar. It's not merely familiar. It's yours, Judge Thornton." She turned toward the bench and stared directly at him, her gaze unflinching, every word landing like a strike to the gavel he'd once used to control this room. "You authorized this. You approved the payment. You opened the gate that allowed public funds to disappear into a fake entity. And now you're trying to pretend you don't recognize your own penmanship? The silence wasn't just deafening, it was destabilizing. It felt like the entire courtroom had tilted, like the walls themselves were leaning in to listen. One of the jurors, a middle-aged man with silver-framed glasses, slowly removed them to wipe his face, as if needing to confirm he was still in reality. Reporters weren't writing anymore. They were staring, open-mouthed, eyes wide like they were watching a plane nosedive in slow motion. Mitchell at the defense table now sat pale and stiff, his hands folded tightly in front of his lips, eyes darting between Jasmine and the judge like a man suddenly realizing he had boarded the wrong train. Jasmine let the moment sit, long enough for the weight of her words to settle over every inch of the courtroom. Then she stepped forward again, closing the space between her and the bench with the confidence of someone who had spent years being underestimated and had learned to make that her greatest weapon. This isn't a speculative theory or a partisan stunt, she continued, her tone razor-sharp now. This is documented misconduct, signed in ink, certified by the Department of Justice's Forensic Division, and now entered into the public record of this trial. She tapped the screen once more, where the signature analysis lit up side by side with Thornton's verified filings. Stroke-by-stroke match, ink pressure consistency, spacing, angle identical. She paused, her eyes narrowed. Unless, of course, you'd like to suggest someone is forging your name in your writing style and submitting those documents through government channels without your knowledge? The courtroom breathed in one collective gasp, a sharp, stinging intake of air. Thornton didn't answer. Couldn't. He leaned slightly back in his chair, and for the first time, his stature seemed smaller. The authority that once radiated from behind the bench now flickered like a dying bulb. His hands were clasped together tightly, but even from a distance, it was clear they were trembling. Jasmine didn't need a confession. She already had everything she came for. The truth is right here, she said, holding up the signed contract one last time, and the only thing left now is whether this courtroom is willing to follow it or protect the man sitting on that bench. It was no longer just about a document, or a signature, or even the money. It was about whether this courtroom, this sacred place of justice, would have the courage to admit that its own gatekeeper was the one who opened the door to corruption. Jasmine stood alone in that space, not just as an attorney or a representative of the White House, but as a symbol of something bigger, a challenge to the idea that power protects itself forever. And in that moment, as the judge sat wordless behind his name and the room trembled with the weight of revelation, Jasmine Crockett became the most powerful voice in the building. Jasmine didn't reach for the next folder. She didn't raise her voice. She simply stepped closer to the bench, her heels striking the floor like a metronome, counting down to detonation. Her fingers hovered over the audio device resting on the clerk's desk. Then, with chilling calm, she said, "Your Honor, with the court's permission, I'd like to play a short recording." She didn't wait for his answer. "It's Exhibit 47, submitted, authenticated, and cleared by the Department of Justice." She gave a nod to the clerk. The man hesitated, just for a fraction of a second, then pressed play. At first, there was only static. Then a voice filled the room. It was unmistakable, deep, calculated, authoritative. But it wasn't from the bench. It was coming through the speakers. "If she finds that document, I'll make it disappear before it ever reaches court." The words fell into the courtroom like a guillotine blade. Nobody breathed. The sentence repeated in the minds of everyone present, echoing louder the second time around, as if the walls themselves were absorbing the treason. Jasmine didn't move. She didn't even blink. She stood perfectly still, letting the silence speak louder than any accusation ever could. A woman in the jury box pressed her hand to her chest. A man next to her sat stiff, eyes locked forward, jaw clenched so tight his temple throbbed. The reporters in the gallery, some seasoned, some young, froze mid-scribble, unsure whether to write or listen or run. At the defense table, Mitchell finally stirred. His eyes bulged, his lips parted, then closed again. He turned to his attorney, whispering something in a hoarse, broken tone. The lawyer just stared at the table, blinking furiously, as if trying to make the moment disappear. But it wouldn't. It couldn't. because it had been spoken, captured, and played aloud for everyone to hear. Jasmine finally broke the silence, not with rage, not with arrogance, but with a voice forged in fire, measured, steady, impossible to look away from. "That is the voice of Edward Thornton," she said, "presiding judge of this courtroom, recorded on a federal wiretap. The same voice that signed the contract authorizing a multi-million-dollar transfer to a fraudulent entity." Her words sliced through the room. "This isn't speculation. It's not political theater. It's the confession of a man who believed he was above the law, who used his position not to uphold justice, but to destroy it." She walked slowly to the front of the courtroom, her back to Thornton now, facing the jury. "You heard it yourselves. This isn't circumstantial. It's not out of context. He wasn't joking. He wasn't misquoted. He was caught." She held up the DOJ certified audio report, the department's seal gleaming under the lights. 3 separate analysts confirmed the voice print, time-stamped, location verified, chain of custody intact. She turned her head just slightly toward the bench. "He said he'd make it disappear, and that's what he's done for years. Silenced whistleblowers, buried files, dismissed motions without cause. That wasn't the first time. It was just the first time someone recorded it." The murmurs began, quiet at first. A woman in the gallery whispered, "This is unbelievable." A man near the back leaned forward, muttering, "This is a setup. It has to be." But even he didn't sound convinced. Another juror leaned forward, her knuckles white against the polished rail, eyes wide with disbelief. She turned to her seatmate and whispered, "He was the judge in my uncle's case." The courtroom was no longer watching a trial. They were living the collapse of a fortress, brick by brick, tradition by tradition, unraveling in real time. Judge Thornton sat motionless, but his skin had turned ashen. The blood had drained from his face, leaving only 2 wide, glassy eyes, searching, twitching, refusing to meet Jasmine's. His hands clenched the edge of the bench, the polished oak creaking beneath the strain. But the gavel, the one he had wielded like a weapon all morning, remained untouched. Jasmine glanced at it just once, and then back to the jury. "That voice," she said softly, "was never meant to be heard. It was meant to keep power in the shadows. But now it belongs to you, to all of us. And it's up to this court to decide whether truth still matters in this country or whether it disappears too." Another wave of gasps. A man in the jury whispered, "He's guilty. He's done." The defense lawyer fumbled his briefcase open with shaking fingers, frantically thumbing through papers that could no longer protect anyone. Mitchell's hand went to his forehead as if trying to cover his eyes from what had already been seen. A young reporter stood, his mouth open, not even realizing he'd knocked over his chair. Jasmine didn't move. She didn't gloat. She let the weight of truth do what it was designed to do: crush arrogance, strip away power, and leave only the evidence behind. And the recording? It continued to play, the full clip now unraveling like a confession from the void. "She's too young to pull it off, but if she finds anything, I'll shut it down, I'll bury it." That voice, that man, that lie, all of it now exposed. And in that moment, the courtroom no longer belonged to Edward Thornton. It belonged to the truth, and Jasmine Crockett was its final messenger. The courtroom was still vibrating with the echo of his own voice, cold, calculating, and now immortalized in federal audio evidence. Judge Thornton's knuckles were white against the polished wood of the bench, his grip so tight the veins in his hands looked like they might split. The authority he once wielded like a sledgehammer now dangled loosely, a faded robe over shoulders that suddenly seemed too narrow to carry it. He didn't dare meet the eyes of the jury. Not yet. Instead, his gaze dropped to the edge of the bench, as though the grain of the oak might offer him a lifeline. And then he spoke, slow, brittle, painfully measured. "This court," he began, pausing to swallow hard, "will enter a temporary recess." A hush rolled through the room like a dust storm. "In light of newly introduced material," he continued, avoiding the words recording and voice like they were poison, "I am ordering an immediate review of the evidence presented under Exhibit 47. Until that review is complete, All proceedings are to be suspended. The moment he said it, the air shifted, not with relief, but with outrage barely restrained. Jasmine didn't move, but her presence flared in the silence. Her chin lifted slightly, her eyes still locked on the man who had just tried to sweep an avalanche under a rug. The jury began to shift. One man rubbed his temples with both hands. His lips pursed in disbelief. A woman in the front row narrowed her eyes and crossed her arms, leaning back in her seat as if to say, "You think this stall will save you?" Even Robert Mitchell, the accused, turned toward Thornton with a look of dawning betrayal. He knew what this meant now. His protector was faltering. His shield had cracked. The reporters in the gallery burst into hushed chaos. One typed furiously on a laptop, muttering, "Judge halts trial after his own voice is played in court." Another grabbed her phone and whispered into the mic, "This is a tactical delay, nothing more." "He's cornered." The court clerk looked visibly shaken, his pen frozen midair, as if unsure whether to record the announcement or flee from it. And through it all, Thornton tried to maintain the posture of control, tapping his gavel lightly, once, twice, as if the sound might still command order. But even that tap felt hollow now, a desperate echo of a throne already burning. He cleared his throat again, more forcefully this time. "We will reconvene after appropriate authentication protocols have been followed. The integrity of this courtroom," he added, as if remembering the script too late, "requires that all materials, regardless of origin, undergo proper legal vetting before influencing judgment." But his words didn't carry. They scattered like leaves in a storm. He was speaking to a room that had already made up its mind. Justice didn't need more time. It needed courage. And the man behind the bench had just failed his first test. Jasmine finally shifted, stepping toward the evidence table. Not to protest, not to argue, but to reclaim the moment with her presence alone. Her silence was louder than any legal objection. She didn't need to challenge Thornton's order. Everyone already knew what it meant. This wasn't about protocol. This was about panic. The walls were closing in, and the judge who once ruled over this courtroom like a monarch was now barricading himself inside it. And even he knew it wouldn't hold for long. Justice was no longer waiting at the door. It was kicking it in. Jasmine didn't retreat when Thornton slammed the gavel. She advanced. Her heels clicked on the marble floor with deliberate weight, each step punctuating her refusal to be intimidated. She reached the center of the courtroom, turned to face the bench fully, and spoke, not with defiance, but with conviction that made the walls seem closer. "Respectfully, Your Honor," she began, her voice low but ironclad, "what's happening here is no longer a matter of process. This is now a matter of public trust, and the evidence just introduced, the contract bearing your signature, the audio recording of your own voice, demands more than delay. It demands intervention." She raised her hand and held up a printed motion, stamped and ready. "Therefore, I move that the court immediately authorize an independent investigative unit from the Justice Department to enter these chambers and begin formal verification and custody of all related materials, including your correspondence and authorizations related to the Everon transaction." The courtroom stirred like a dam about to break. No one spoke, but no one looked away. "You've asked us to pause, to verify the truth. I say we verify it now in real time, with neutral oversight and public accountability. That is the only way forward." Judge Thornton's composure shattered. His eyes widened, and his hand slammed the gavel so hard it cracked against the wood. "Out of order," he barked, rising halfway from his chair. "You are out of line, Miss Crockett. This is my courtroom, and I will not allow it to become a circus driven by personal ambition and media theater." The anger spilled out like acid, loud, unfocused, desperate. But the damage was already done. His voice trembled on the last syllables. His robe seemed heavier on his shoulders. He no longer looked like the judge. He looked like the defendant. Jasmine took one step closer, not flinching at the roar. Her face didn't change. Her voice didn't rise. But when she spoke, it reverberated. "With all due respect, Your Honor," she said, "the only circus here is one where the judge is caught on federal surveillance plotting to conceal evidence. And if you believe that gavel can silence the law, you've forgotten what justice looks like." Her words hit like thunder. The gallery gasped audibly. One juror leaned forward, jaw slightly open. Another muttered, "Did she just—" but never finished the sentence. And then Jasmine turned, not to the judge, but to the jury. "You've all heard what he said. You've seen the signatures. You've witnessed how the law bends when power tries to protect itself." She held up the audio transcript, her hand steady. "Now ask yourselves, if this were anyone else, anyone sitting where Mr. Mitchell is right now, would we be delaying an investigation, or would we be demanding one? Because if the answer changes depending on who's behind the bench, then we're not in a court. We're in a palace." The courtroom was boiling now. One reporter whispered into her phone, "She just flipped the room. He's not in control anymore." Even the bailiff looked unsure, his eyes darting between the two. And Thornton? He stood frozen, lips parted, eyes glassy with rage and something dangerously close to fear. The gavel had fallen silent. The judge who once ruled with dismissive precision was now drowning in his own chaos. Jasmine turned back to him one last time. "You say I'm out of order, but I say justice is out of reach unless we act now. So I ask again, will you authorize the DOJ to begin their independent inquiry, or will you block that too?" The room went still, not quiet, still, as if the courtroom itself was holding its breath, as if even the walls were waiting for an answer. Because the next move wasn't just about protocol, it would reveal whether the justice system could still hold a man like Edward Thornton accountable. And in that moment, with the world watching and truth burning through the courtroom like wildfire, it became clear Jasmine wasn't asking anymore. She was daring him. The courtroom was shaking, not from motion, but from a kind of emotional voltage pulsing through every person present. Jasmine's last words still echoed in the chamber like a war drum. "Will you authorize an independent inquiry, or will you block that too?" The weight of the moment had rendered everyone silent. Jurors were frozen in disbelief, journalists stunned into stillness. Even Robert Mitchell, the once smirking defendant, sat slumped in his seat, watching the judge unravel. Then, boom! The double doors of the courtroom flung open with a crack so loud it silenced even breath. All eyes turned. Gasps followed, sharp and collective, as if the entire room had just been struck by lightning. There she was, Attorney General Pam Bondi, her silhouette cut through the light like a blade, standing in stark contrast against the bright hallway behind her. Her face was unreadable, calm but fierce, like a commander arriving on a battlefield she already knew she would win. Flanking her were two federal Justice Department officers in crisp Navy uniforms, badges gleaming, each step synchronized and final. The echo of their boots on the courtroom floor was like a death march. Bondi didn't stop to look around. She walked straight up the center aisle, shoulders squared, gaze locked like a missile on the bench above. And the moment she reached the edge of the raised platform, she spoke. No hesitation, no wasted breath. Her voice rang out like a verdict cast from Olympus. "Judge Edward Thornton," she declared, her tone surgically calm but crackling with force. "Under federal order, you are hereby placed under arrest for obstruction of justice, conspiracy to commit fraud, and criminal abuse of judicial authority." Gasps exploded through the gallery. Someone whispered, "Oh my God!" Another dropped their phone with a hard clack against the tile. Jurors recoiled, jaws slack, eyes wide as moons. The court clerk sat stunned, blinking rapidly behind his glasses, while reporters surged forward instinctively, cameras lifted, shutters clicking like machine guns. It was chaos, but righteous chaos. And at the center of it all stood Thornton, the man who once ruled this courtroom with a sneer and a gavel, now gripping the edge of his bench like a man hanging from a cliff. "You can't," he stammered, voice rising an octave, cracking under its own weight. This is my courtroom." He stood suddenly, knocking his chair back, fists clenched, veins bulging. "You don't have jurisdiction. This is a setup." But even as he shouted, he knew. No one believed him. No one was with him. The gavel on the bench, a symbol he had clung to for decades, lay sideways, abandoned and silent. Pam Bondi didn't blink. "You lost your courtroom the moment you tried to erase the evidence," she said coldly. Then she turned to her officers. "Cuff him. The agents moved fast, calm, professional, absolute. One reached for Thornton's arm, the other unclipped the handcuffs. "Don't touch me," Thornton snarled, yanking his arm back, eyes darting like a trapped animal. "I am a federal judge. You don't understand. I can explain all of this." But no one moved to stop the officers. The gallery watched in stunned silence. Even the defense attorney looked away, ashamed. Mitchell was now cowering in his chair, whispering something panicked to no one. The first cuff clicked shut around Thornton's right wrist. He gasped, more in disbelief than pain. The second one followed with a sharp metallic snap. The sound echoed like a final judgment. The man who had wielded the power to sentence others now stood shackled in his own courtroom, robe billowing awkwardly over his hands bound in front of him. Jasmine stood motionless, watching it all unfold with quiet clarity. She didn't smile. There was no triumph in her face, only resolve. This wasn't vengeance. This was the reckoning that had been long overdue. Thornton looked to her one last time, face contorted with rage, humiliation, and something far uglier, fear. "You did this," he spat, voice trembling. "This is your doing." But Jasmine didn't flinch. She met his gaze with unwavering calm. "No," she said quietly. "You did this to yourself. I just made sure everyone saw it." The agents turned him toward the doors, leading him down the center aisle. The same path he'd walked 1,000 times with pomp and posture, now reduced to a man stripped of all illusion. Reporters shouted questions. "Judge Thornton, do you deny the recording? Did you falsify the contract?" But he said nothing, just stumbled forward, sweat trickling down his temple. The jurors sat stunned. One woman wiped away a tear. Another man exhaled deeply, as if he'd been holding his breath since the trial began. Mitchell's lawyer slumped in his chair. The bailiff, unsure what to do, simply stepped aside. As the courtroom doors swung shut behind Thornton and the echo of his final steps faded into silence, Pam Bondi turned to the stunned crowd. "This trial will resume under new judicial authority," she said, her voice commanding the room like a general. "The Justice Department will launch a full investigation into any and all parties connected to this corruption, effective immediately." Then with a nod toward Jasmine, she added, "And we owe our thanks to the woman who refused to be silenced." The courtroom erupted, not in chaos this time, but in applause. Applause from jurors, from observers, from journalists who were now part of a story far greater than they'd expected. Jasmine stood still, not basking in it, but standing for what came next. Because this wasn't the end. It was the beginning of justice finally walking back through the door. Robert Mitchell stood like a man whose past had just caught up with him in real time. Gone was the polished real estate tycoon in a $1,000 suit. Gone was the smug smirk he'd worn for weeks during the trial. In his place was a trembling man, his tie loose, sweat soaking through the collar of his designer shirt, eyes wild with fear. "Wait!" he shouted, stumbling forward as the last click of Judge Thornton's handcuffs still echoed in his ears. "You don't understand. I wasn't in charge. I was just doing what I was told." His voice cracked, then rose higher as panic overrode reason. "I'll testify. I'll hand over my entire financial database, encrypted drives, offshore accounts, donor lists, anything you want. Just please, don't let this fall on me alone." Jasmine didn't even blink. Her gaze locked on him, steady as steel, and when she spoke, it was colder than the cuffs that had just left with Thornton. "You orchestrated this scheme," she said, her voice calm, deliberate, slicing through the courtroom's air like a scalpel through silk. "You funneled taxpayer money into fake shell companies. You bribed officials, falsified invoices, laundered millions through public contracts, and then sat there, right there, smirking through every hearing like the rules didn't apply to you." She took a single pointed step closer. "And now that your judge is gone and your safety net's been ripped apart, you want to cooperate?" Her eyes narrowed. "You're not sorry. You're scared." Mitchell's lips parted in stunned silence. He looked around the courtroom as if realizing for the first time he was truly alone. His attorney stared blankly at the desk, refusing to meet his eye. Reporters leaned forward in eerie synchronization, pens scribbling madly. Cameras flashed, capturing the collapse in real time. And then a juror, an older black man seated in the back row, rose slowly from his seat, his face stern, his hands clenched. He said nothing, but his silence spoke volumes. Next, a woman in the middle row stood as well, her jaw tight, chin lifted in grim resolution. One by one, they began rising. No instructions, no cue, just instinct. They were no longer mere spectators in the legal theater. They were witnesses to a turning tide. They were the moral compass reorienting itself. Mitchell took a staggering step backward, eyes darting from juror to juror, like a man watching his past sins line up to pass judgment. "No, please, I can name names," he begged. "Thornton wasn't the only one. There were senators, executives. I'll help bring them down." His words rang out, but they no longer carried weight. Not here, not now. Jasmine stood with the poise of someone who had seen power corrupt and now watched it fracture at the knees. "You had your window," she said coldly. "We offered you a deal before this trial began. You ignored it. You lied under oath. You hid behind influence, behind arrogance, behind Judge Thornton. And now you want the system you cheated to save you?" Her voice hardened, each syllable measured and merciless. "There is no deal. There is only accountability." The courtroom seemed to tilt with those words. Reporters gasped. A woman in the gallery covered her mouth. Mitchell sank into his chair as if trying to disappear into the cushion, but there was nowhere left to run. The courtroom was no longer his stage. It had become his reckoning. From the jury box, a woman in a pale blue blazer took a step forward, her voice clear and controlled. "We're ready," she said to no one in particular, but everyone heard her. "We know what he did. We've heard enough." Another juror followed, then another. Soon, nearly the entire panel was on their feet, a silent wall of consequence rising before the man who once believed his money could outrun justice. Mitchell whimpered, actually whimpered, his hands shaking as he tried to gather his notes, his papers, his useless briefcase. But none of it mattered. The charade was over. Jasmine turned slowly toward the jury, her expression softening for the first time. Not in mercy, but in quiet recognition. These weren't just citizens. They were justice incarnate. "Thank you," she said gently. "Your courage here today will echo far beyond these walls." And as Mitchell buried his face in his hands, surrounded by 12 standing sentinels and the full force of exposed truth, the courtroom entered a new kind of silence. Not the kind born from fear or confusion, but from power rediscovered. It was the silence that comes when justice has finally, irrevocably, taken its place at the front of the room. The black SUV pulled into the White House perimeter just as the sun began to dip below the horizon, casting streaks of amber and crimson across the marble columns. Jasmine Crockett sat in the back seat, still dressed in her courtroom suit, creased, worn, but carrying the weight of a war just won. Her eyes stared ahead, unmoving, as the Secret Service agent opened the door. The guards saluted her as she stepped out, not as a formality, but with genuine reverence. She climbed the steps slowly, each footfall echoing the gravity of what she had just done. The doors opened. The corridors inside were quiet, but only on the surface. Inside the West Wing, the air crackled with something electric. Word had already reached every floor. Judge Thornton in handcuffs. Mitchell begging for mercy. A courtroom no longer afraid to stand. When Jasmine entered the Oval Office, President Trump was already standing behind his desk, his arms folded, expression unreadable. For a long second, he said nothing. He just looked at her, like a man assessing not her performance, but her will. Then he stepped forward, and his voice broke the silence, deep and deliberate. "You just changed history," he said, each word precise. "You didn't just take down corruption. You reminded this country what justice sounds like when it's not afraid." He extended his hand, then pulled her into a firm, almost paternal embrace. "Damn proud of you." Jasmine exhaled for the first time since she'd left the courthouse, her spine still stiff with adrenaline, but her pulse beginning to settle. Trump released her and stepped back, pointing to the television behind his desk. Broadcasts lit up with images of Thornton being walked out in cuffs, Jasmine standing tall beside Pam Bondi. Headlines screamed across the ticker, "Federal judge arrested in courtroom bombshell." Jasmine Crockett uncovers massive judicial corruption. White House legal firebrand brings down a titan. Trump gestured toward the screen, then turned back to her with a smirk. They said you were too young, too green, too media-trained for the real fight. But you walked into that courtroom and turned it upside down. You didn't flinch. You didn't ask for permission. You made the truth impossible to ignore. Jasmine gave a slight nod, emotion swelling behind her eyes but still holding firm. But Jasmine didn't smile. Not yet. Sir, she said quietly, it's bigger than just Thornton. She stepped forward and placed a manila folder on the desk. Mitchell started to talk. In the last 40 minutes, he's named 11 individuals, 2 sitting congressmen, 1 former CIA contractor, a judge in Ohio, and 3 corporate executives linked to national infrastructure projects. He's terrified. He knows the game is over. He's ready to barter for air. She opened the folder slowly, revealing a list of names, some already underlined in red. These people aren't just complicit. They're architects. They helped design the machine. Trump leaned over the desk, his eyes scanning the list. His fingers tapped against the leather blotter, a slow rhythm of pressure building. I know a few of these names, he muttered, and I know what they think of themselves. Kingmakers, puppeteers, people who believe they can live in the shadows while pulling strings in every branch of power. His jaw clenched. But this, he pointed at the list, this is the reckoning they never saw coming. Jasmine met his eyes, unwavering. They operated under the assumption that the courts were theirs, that judges like Thornton would keep their secrets buried, that whistleblowers wouldn't survive, that people like me wouldn't make it past opening remarks. Her voice darkened, steady and heavy. We've shattered that illusion, but now we need to push. Trump nodded slowly, his gaze drifting to the window, where the sun was now a thin gold line on the horizon. The shadows in the Oval Office lengthened. I want a task force, not tomorrow. Tonight, he said, turning sharply. Bondi leads it. You're embedded in it. I want DOJ, Homeland, IRS, CIA, hell, bring in Treasury if you have to. I want names, records, subpoenas. He stepped forward, lowering his voice into a quiet storm. We're not in campaign season anymore. We're in war. And when you're in a war this deep, you don't play defense. You break the doors down before they lock them. Jasmine reached into her briefcase and pulled out a second folder, thicker than the first. Then this is where we start. Mitchell gave us access codes to encrypted financial vaults overseas, Cayman, Zurich, even Dubai. He's turned over internal memos detailing wire transfers to fake nonprofit fronts. Everything's time-stamped. All of it tracks back to a communications hub in Northern Virginia. She paused, eyes narrowing. That hub was approved by a federal oversight committee whose chairperson is on this list. Trump's lips parted in a humorless smile, cold, almost grim. So now we're at the part where oversight turned into cover-up. He shook his head slowly. Let them hear the footsteps coming, Jasmine. Let them know that the girl they mocked in press briefings, the courtroom they tried to humiliate you in, the law they tried to twist, none of it worked. He turned back toward her, voice sharper now. We dragged them all into the light, every last one. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Outside, sirens wailed faintly in the distance. Inside, the lamp on the president's desk illuminated Jasmine's face, carved with exhaustion and fury and purpose. Her hands trembled, but not from fear, from momentum. Sir, she said, voice low, they thought no one would ever challenge them, that someone like me, black, young, unbought, would break under pressure. She looked down at the list. They never imagined I'd walk into their sanctuary and tear it down with the truth. Trump stepped around the desk, standing beside her now. And that's exactly why we're going to win, he said, because you don't owe them anything. You didn't rise through their machine. You don't speak in backroom code. You walked into that courtroom with nothing but the Constitution and your voice, and you turned it into a weapon. His voice dropped to a growl. Now let's finish what you started. Jasmine nodded. She didn't thank him. She didn't need to. They were past gratitude, past ceremony. They were standing in the heart of the American government, planning a purge. She turned to leave, folders under her arm, fire in her step. And as she crossed the doorway into the West Wing's corridor, staffers moved aside. Some nodded. Others just stared. Everyone knew something had changed. And Jasmine Crockett, exhausted, relentless, and still wearing the ashes of a courtroom in chaos, was the woman who lit the match. It had been exactly 4 days since the courtroom detonated into history. 4 days since Jasmine Crockett stood in the eye of the storm and didn't blink. Since Thornton's gavel fell for the final time, not in power, but in panic, and handcuffs replaced his authority. But even in Washington, 4 days could stretch like eternity when the truth was spreading faster than spin. The fallout had been seismic. Headlines screamed from every screen. Networks dissected every moment. Justice Department servers lit up with subpoenas. And now in a quiet federal transfer facility just south of the Capitol, history waited to be signed, cuffed, and filed into the system. Jasmine stepped into the holding room flanked by 2 agents. The air was sterile, the fluorescent lights overhead buzzing like nervous whispers. At the center of the room sat Pam Bondi, composed, crisp in her DOJ blazer, arms folded loosely, eyes fixed forward. When she saw Jasmine enter, she didn't speak. She didn't need to. She gave a slight nod, just enough to say everything. You did it. You didn't flinch. And now the reckoning begins. Then the steel door on the far wall hissed open. 2 more agents entered, dragging behind them a man who once signed government checks with swagger. Robert Mitchell. His suit was gone, replaced by an orange jumpsuit that couldn't hide the sweat staining his collar. His hands were cuffed. His eyes darted wildly between the 2 women who had brought his empire to its knees. And then he broke. "I'll cooperate," he shouted, voice frantic and hoarse. "You want names? I've got them. Dozens of them. Senators, fundraisers, judges, even someone in DHS. He stumbled forward, nearly tripping over his own shackles. "I swear to God, I'll tell you everything. Just get me out of this. I'll sign whatever you want." Jasmine didn't react. Not at first. She just stepped forward until they were 3 feet apart, one standing like justice in heels, the other squirming like a snake in a box. She studied him for a moment, her expression unreadable. The same man who had once laughed in court while she argued motions, the same man who had ordered fake invoices and laundered millions through nonprofit shells while public schools starved. Now he was pleading for mercy, for oxygen, for another chance. Her voice was quiet when it came, but every word struck like a rifle crack. "You had a window," she said. "You were offered a deal before the trial even started. You had every opportunity to come clean, to name names, to be something more than the fraud you became." She leaned in just slightly, her voice sharpening to a whisper. "But you chose arrogance. You chose silence. And now?" She stepped back, her expression hardening to granite. "Now it's too late." Mitchell's mouth quivered. His knees buckled just slightly. He turned toward Bondi, reaching out helplessly. "Please, at least talk to her. Tell her I'll sign everything. I'm ready. I'll go public. I'll testify on live TV if I have to." But Bondi didn't move. She simply looked at him with eyes that had seen too many men try the same thing. "You're not useful," she said flatly. "You're just loud." The agent stepped forward and grabbed Mitchell by the arms, dragging him back toward the hallway he came from. His voice trailed into the corridor behind them, echoing in desperate repetition. "I'll cooperate. I swear. I swear. Just let me talk. Don't let it end like this." But it had already ended. The door slammed shut with a hydraulic hiss, and silence reclaimed the room. Pam turned to Jasmine, arms still crossed, but a small flicker of a smile crept into the corner of her mouth. "You didn't just win a case," she said softly. "You made history." Jasmine nodded once, her expression calm but resolute. "Then let's write the next chapter," she replied. "Because this wasn't the end of justice. This was the beginning of a new standard. You've lived long enough to see the difference between a headline and the truth. Long enough to know how many times the real story never makes it to the front page. You've watched powerful men walk away from trials without a scratch, while whistleblowers lost their jobs, their pensions, sometimes their lives. You saw the banks collapse in 2008, watched executives skate free while working men lost their homes. You remember Iran-Contra, Watergate, Enron. You saw the hearings, the scandals, the scripted outrage, and then the silence that always came after. The message was clear. Accountability is for the little guy. The law bends, power protects itself. And maybe somewhere between your 20s and your 50s, you stopped expecting anything different because they told you justice is idealistic, that it's naive to expect fairness when backroom deals and campaign donations keep the machine running. So you buried the fire, you raised your kids, paid your taxes, kept your head down, and told yourself, that's just how it is now. You didn't get cynical, you got tired. But then you saw her. You saw Jasmine Crockett walk into a courtroom where the fix was already in and blow it wide open. A woman half the age of the man she exposed with nothing but a case file and the truth, tearing through a system that told her to sit down and smile for the cameras. You watched her stand unshaken as a federal judge tried to humiliate her in public, only for her to turn the tide and put him in handcuffs. No secret deal, no slap on the wrist, just cold, hard evidence and a woman who refused to blink. And you saw Pam Bondi, the Attorney General, who didn't hide behind procedure or protocol. She didn't wait for the news cycle to change. She marched into that courtroom like a hammer and said the words no one thought would ever be spoken to a man like Edward Thornton. You are under arrest, in real time, on camera, before the ink on his latest cover-up could even dry. You've seen this before. Not this exact story, but the spirit of it. You saw it when Frank Serpico refused to take the dirty money and ended up shot in the face by the very force he served. You saw it when Aaron Brockovich walked into conference rooms filled with lawyers in suits, holding nothing but a folder of poison water samples, and refused to leave until she made them pay. You saw it when ordinary people did the extraordinary, not because they were powerful, but because they were right. And now Jasmine and Bondi have joined that lineage. This wasn't a press stunt. It wasn't a political maneuver. It was a takedown built on blood, sweat, subpoenas, and grit. They didn't just hold a corrupt judge accountable. They sent a warning to every backroom operator still sipping whiskey in private clubs, laughing at the idea that justice ever makes it past a press release. They're not laughing now. And maybe you, sitting there, felt something stir again, something you thought you'd lost. Not blind faith, not naivete, but a spark. The thought that maybe the system isn't completely broken, that maybe when the right people walk in, unbought, unshaken, and unafraid, it still works. Maybe the oath still means something. Maybe truth still hits harder than spin. So if you've spent years thinking, it doesn't matter anymore, let this remind you, it does. Because justice is not a relic. It's a fight, a long one, a dirty one. And it needs people who've seen too much to give up, men like you. This isn't the end of the story. It's a spark. And if you carry that spark, speak about it, teach it, protect it, it becomes something else. It becomes legacy. Because justice didn't die on your watch. It was just waiting for someone brave enough to bring it back to life. And now that it's breathing again, don't let it go. Thank you for watching until this moment and for standing with us on this journey for justice. Your support means everything. Like subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss what's next. And we'd love to hear your thoughts. Leave a comment below and let us know what moved you most in this story. Together, our voices make a difference. So now the gavel has fallen and the dust has begun to settle. Jasmine Crockett stood before a judge who tried to mock her, silence her, and discredit her, only for the chains to be wrapped around his own wrists. Pam Bondi marched into a courtroom and did what millions of Americans never thought they'd see. She arrested a sitting federal judge in open court, not behind closed doors, not quietly. She did it in front of reporters, jurors, lawyers, and cameras. And she did it without flinching. You watched it unfold. Maybe you watched in disbelief, maybe with cautious hope, or maybe, if you're like so many men over 50, you watched with a kind of quiet awe, because you've lived long enough to know what usually happens. The people in power walk, the money changes hands, the headlines fade, the anger cools, the cycle resets. But this time, something broke. This time, justice wasn't just a word. It had a face, a voice, a presence that refused to back down. Jasmine Crockett didn't ask for permission to be respected. She didn't soften her voice to be palatable. She didn't play by the script written for her. She came prepared. She came with the truth. And when Judge Thornton tried to discredit her, when he mocked her youth, her title, her presence in his courtroom, she stood taller. She didn't ask him to believe her. She forced him to hear her. And when she dropped the evidence, his own signature on fraudulent transfers, his own voice caught on tape, she didn't blink, because she knew that justice isn't given. It's taken back. That is why you're here now, because that moment wasn't just powerful. It was personal. You've been told too many times to stay out of it. You've been told it's rigged, that the swamp never drains, that no one gets punished. And let's be honest, you've seen proof of that for decades. You've watched the guilty walk away in limos while the honest go broke. You've seen cops who tried to expose corruption get bullets instead of medals. You remember Frank Serpico. You remember what it cost him. You remember Aaron Brockovich showing up to $1 million conference table in a thrift store skirt and burning giants to the ground with a stack of water reports. And now, you've seen it again, through Jasmine and Bondi. Which brings us to now. The question is simple. What will you do with this moment? Will it just be another video in your feed? Another headline that leaves you shaking your head? Or will you carry it? Speak about it? Let it light something inside you that may have dimmed over the years? Because this isn't just about one judge in one courtroom. This is about a system that for too long has bet on your silence. They count on men like you, the backbone of this country, the ones who built families, served in wars, worked union jobs, paid off mortgages, and buried their friends, to stop believing. They count on your exhaustion, your heartbreak, your decision to look away. Because when men like you stop paying attention, they don't just get away with crimes. They rewrite the rules to make them legal. So here's the call. Don't look away. Don't let this moment pass unmarked. Share the story. Talk about it at the barbershop, the coffee shop, the union hall. Tell your sons, your nephews, your buddies who served with you, justice just made a comeback. Not in theory, in handcuffs. Let them know that yes, the system can still work, but only if people are watching. Only if people are demanding it. Only if someone is brave enough to stand up and say, I remember what justice is supposed to look like, and that wasn't it. Write your representative. Ask them where they stand. Ask them what they're doing to prevent the next Thornton. Show up to town halls. Demand full transparency in your local courts. Volunteer for oversight boards. Vote, not just for party, but for principle. You've seen what happens when good men stay silent. Now imagine what happens when they speak. Because justice isn't automatic. It's not a machine. It's not a flowchart that always ends the same way. Justice is messy. It's loud. It's slow and infuriating and painful. But it's not dead. It just needs people willing to drag it, kicking and screaming, back into the daylight. And it needs you. You who watched Watergate unfold on a black and white television. You who stood in a factory line and watched executives steal pensions. You who wore a uniform and defended a constitution that promised equality under the law and wondered why it's so rarely delivered. You've seen what happens when people in power think they're untouchable. And now, for the first time in years, you've seen what happens when they're not. Let that fuel you. Let it remind you that truth still matters, that evidence can still speak louder than money, that public servants who don't serve the public can still be held to account, that one woman with a voice in a folder full of documents can still walk into a courtroom and make giants tremble. Because Jasmine Crockett didn't come from a dynasty. She didn't rise through backdoor channels. She was underestimated, dismissed, mocked, and still she won. She didn't win for a party. She didn't win for a paycheck. She won for truth. And now it's your turn.